Hello friends, support us on Patreon. Rob Caskie, proudly telling stories. We were recently down in the Cape, that southwestern tip of Africa, known to most South Africans as the Mother City, what Sir Francis Drake once described as the fairest Cape in all the world. And indeed on a sunny summer's day, it's got to be one of the most mesmerizing and beguiling places of them all. With the backdrop of Table Mountain, Lion's Head, and Signal Hill, it really is a quite exquisite part of the world. And I'm always intrigued by the histories that come out of the Cape. You know, when the Dutch East India Company established a replenishment station here for the ships moving from Europe around the Cape to the spice-rich east and back, they needed a place to get meat, fresh vegetables, water, and so forth. And indeed, with the Dutch East India Company came the officials, and with them the slaves, from places like Indonesia, Batavia, Madagascar, parts of Central Africa. And indeed with them came the influence of language, of dance, of song, and indeed of food. And one of our South African dishes that we call bobotie is indeed what we call a Cape Malay dish. It actually originated way back in the lovely land of Malaysia. And I'm intrigued by stories of people like the Van der Stels. Simon van der Stel, governor of the Cape, gave his brother a huge tract of land inland of Somerset West and False Bay that has been forever since known as Vergelegen, situated far away. Indeed, it was a 12-hour horse ride from the headquarters in Cape Town all the way out to Vergelegen, and Willem's brother Adrian established this magnificent wine estate and huge country estate with the help and the resources of the company and indeed its slaves. And in February of 1700, he planted upon that estate 5 camphor trees that in February of this year were fortunate enough to celebrate their 321st birthday. They are the only tree national monument in South Africa. Interesting too to note that Simon van der Stel had a number of mistresses, amongst them a woman called Catharina Rus, or Catharina Ras. And indeed, to compensate her for her efforts and part in his life, he was to award her a tract of land on the edge of the mountains above Torquay and Constantia called Steenberg, literally the mountain of stone, or Stone Mountain. And Catharina Rus must have been quite an impressive woman, because apparently her 4th husband was killed by a lion. And without much ado, Catharina got onto her horse with a firearm and set off on that wild tract of country at that time and dispatched the lion. A brave, brave woman indeed. And isn't it interesting to note that in the 1820s, after the Napoleonic Wars, and indeed the deprivations that were to befall Europe and Britain and parts of Africa after the mighty volcanic explosion in Indonesia called Tambora in 1815, the same year as the Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon was defeated and indeed exiled to St. Helena Island, where he died 6 years later in 1821. As a result of the crop failures on account of the ash cloud created by Tambora, and indeed the social and economic hardships suffered after the Napoleonic Wars, a huge number of people were moved out to the Cape Province, who became known as the 1820 settlers. And they were settled in the region of the Eastern Cape, between the Great Fish and the Kai rivers. It's an area that we call Sourveld, that is really impossible to farm. And indeed it was with that our national sport began. Most folks consider South Africa's national sport to be rugby, but it would indeed be cattle rustling. Because to survive, these folks who'd been economic with the truth regarding their agricultural background and their agricultural acumen came out here on a cheap pass and a cheap ticket. They couldn't farm this inhospitable land, and they began to rustle cattle from the clauses. The clauses indeed began to rustle the cattle back. Eventually it escalated into open warfare, and a huge number of British soldiers were sent out from Britain to try and quell the causes. These 9 frontier wars, as they became known, went on over a period of roughly 7 decades. And the causes are a wily group of warriors. They used to fight naked, covered with red ochre. And in the thick bush, it's impossible to maintain a normal patrol formation. So the men, tired and dusty, marching back to the fort, rifle over the shoulder in single file. The man third from the back would look behind him and see with horror that the 2 men behind him were gone, caught by the causes. And indeed, the choice of torture then was to skin a man alive. And I want you to imagine the terror and the horror of lying in a fort exhausted, listening to the screams of your captured comrades being skinned alive by those mighty Xhosa warriors. And the next day you find their bodies hanging from trees with a clear warning that you might be next. Well, the hardships of the Eastern Cape really are worthy of a completely different lecture and story. Back to the Southwestern Cape, not far from the Eastern Cape, it was in 1834 that a colonial official called Benjamin de Urban promulgated legislation for the emancipation of slaves. Slaves had to be released forthwith, but slave owners would be compensated for their slaves, but had to collect the compensation in person in London. Now, for the average Dutchman, German, Portuguese and others who had slaves in the Cape, they decided that this was British legislation simply to irritate them. And they decided to pack up their families, their slaves, their livestock and their wagons and to set off inland into the interior of South Africa in what became known as the Great Trek, the Great Movement. It is a fascinating part of our history between 1834 and 1838, where between 12 and 14,000 people left the Cape moving inland as a direct response really to the abolition of slavery in the Cape Province. Those trekkers, some moved up into Namibia, which is an incredibly dry region to the north of the Cape. They became known as the Dorstland trekkers, the Thirstland trekkers, because many of them literally died of thirst. Read the accounts of the woman who said, "We found our way back to the Cape by making our way from one dead child's grave to the next." It's a harrowing story. It was indeed those trekkers who came into contact with the early Nguni people who moved down the east coast of Africa by way of the Ndebele, the Swazi, the Xhosa, and the mighty Zulu people. It was that interaction that led to the death of Peter Tief and his followers that eventually would lead to this major retaliation by the Boers, creating in our country probably our most pivotal battle, the Battle of Blood River on the 16th of December of 1838. Now, the Cape is a great place for the growing of wines. It was the French really who brought viticulture and their great wine industry to the Cape. The soils here and the rainfall pattern being a typically Mediterranean climate where the rainfall arrives in winter with these long, dry, hot summers was ideal for the production of grapes for wine. And the city of Cape Town was fed by canals that came down off the mountain of Cape Town, bringing fresh water into the city bowl. The harbour, as you see it today, is very different from the harbour of yesteryear. You need to walk quite a long way from the foreshore up into the city of Cape Town to see where the original Discovery ship docked here in 1900 and way on its way to the Antarctic, carrying Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his hardy crew of explorers who were going to make that first famous British attempt to get to the South Pole. Now, the Cape is today one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Central and Southern Africa. It is indeed a place that is frequented by many visitors. We call them swallows. They come down here for the European and British winter and then return for the European summer and the British summer. It is indeed a place where one can enjoy the most incredible cuisine and wine that we have alluded to often. And of course, the scenery in these parts is quite exquisite if one is to drive inland from the Cape to places like Franschhoek and Paarl and Stellenbosch and even out to Somerset West and around the corner to Hangklip and over the back to Betty's Bay and beyond It is all the most beautiful country where the great Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet. This one warm current coming down the east coast of Africa and the cold current coming down the west coast of Africa. And where these currents meet creates a smorgasbord of marine life. We have incredible whale watching, shark watching, seals, penguins, and fish species frequenting this part of the world. And with South Africa having recently come off the red list in Britain, we are hoping that the British visitors will once again grace us on these shores with their presence, and indeed that we will be able to travel without quarantine back to Britain. But as Francis Drake said, the fairest cape in all the world really is one of South Africa's jewels. A marvelous place to visit, an even greater place to live. And I hope that you've enjoyed this small interjection about some of the Cape's history, some of the Cape's allure and appeal, and indeed part of the reason why I call South Africa home. Thank you all very much.